We spoke to Bijna Kotak Dasani, one of the leading names in global banking and financial services. Bijna has been a champion of the DE&I agenda since early in her career and is today involved in several projects and mentorship programs to improve the diversity agenda within her industry. We spoke to her about building more inclusive workplaces for women and the role for mentorship to support female talent. Hello and welcome to TUSP Conversations. Our guest today is Bijna Kotak Dasani. Bijna, welcome to TUSP Conversations.
Thank you, Danish. Very happy to be with you.
Fine. Thank you, and happy to have you as our guest. So the topic which we're discussing today is bringing more women in finance and why diversity matters. So let me just straight away get into the first question. So you have dedicated most of your career to bridging the diversity gap for women in financial services, right? What got you started on this journey?
So for me, I guess there are multiple dimensions and lenses to this. And I'll walk you through them. There wasn't really a plan or a design around my intent when I first started out. So I landed at an investment bank for an internship when I was at university. And for me, I found that to be a very different and intellectually stimulating environment. I wasn't really clear on where I wanted to be. And what I knew what some of the attributes needed to look like from a career trajectory, but I was reading business. So it was relatively broad. And I hadn't decided whether I wanted to specialize in finance, law, politics. There were different things that I was interested in for different reasons. However, when I then, completed my internship, and then I went back into a graduate program in this industry, what I found over time was that there were very few role models through the ranks. So if you look kind of up the ladder, there were less and less female or identifiable role models. Female was the most obvious one. Gender was the thing people talked about 20 years ago from a diversity lens. But then as you start to become more aware, you see that ethnic minorities are less and less visible. You see people from similar cultures are less and less visible. And for me, and for me, part of the journey was that understanding why do we still have such a long way to go when we live in this, on the outset, a world that is, increasingly technologically connected, increasingly informed. I think it's safe to say, as human beings, we are the most intelligent we have been in our entire existence. We have more technology to enable that intelligence. And so that was one lens. The other was, so that question piece, the other was my own journey, right? So the longer I lasted in financial services, the more my differences were called out. So there were assumptions made about my age, about my color, about my religion, about my ethnicity, about my gender, assumptions that were stereotypes, assumptions that were linked to microaggressions. And again, I chose to work through them. That's just my personality trait. But I also decided that I wanted to make sure that the next set of people that walk through the door, male, female, otherwise, they have a better experience. Now, I'm not claiming that I was able to make all of those changes, but as you get more senior, and as you get more informed, you're able to influence more broadly. And so that's where, I started to not only engage myself in the diversity, equity, and inclusion space, but then I started to do a lot of research. I started to make some data-informed decisions and then cascade those upwards. And then the more senior I became, I was also able to cascade those broadly across the organizations and inform mandates and policy that I felt would provide a better experience for colleagues coming through the door.
And what level do you see the largest gap? Is it at senior position or younger women entering the firms?
I think most organizations, as per the research and the data that I've worked with, right, they tend to have more of a focus on hiring an equal distribution at entry level. The largest gap by far, if you look at any of the data, is and not just financial services. If you look at any sector, any industry, anywhere in the world, any geography, women represent less than, less than a quarter of the C-suite roles, right?
Mm,
And in India, we can. I mean, I know we have an Indian president that was recently elected, but again, she's
mm,
the second one in history.
mm,
United Kingdom, where I'm sitting today, we have a male prime minister that's just kind of moved out, and we have a strong male contender and a strong female contender. But even if the female contender is successful, she will be one in a minority in history. So that's just an example, right? Banking, women are sort of between 15 and 20% of C-suite. We have all these quotas that have come in for women on boards globally. Again, it just strengthens a message that women are far and few in between at senior levels, and that's really where the largest gap absolutely is, without a doubt.
mm. And how important are women mentors and role models in bringing in more women to finance then? I mean, if you
Look,
talk about the sector itself, from you, which you are from.
yeah, I mean, I cannot put enough emphasis on the importance of women role models and mentors. And I personally support a number of mentorship programs outside of the workplace, and I've been a huge advocate of this within the workplace as well. Um, there was a survey or report that Cornell University's School of Industrial and Labor Relations did recently, and they basically found that mentoring programs boosted minority representation at the management level from anywhere between 9 to 24%. If you compare that to other diversity initiatives, it's a huge uplift. The same study also found that these programs dramatically improve promotion and retention rates for both minorities and women by up to 38% compared to non-mentored employees.
Mm,
So rather than, here's what I say, here's what the research from Cornell University says, that, this is significant. If you can support retention and promotion by up to 38% through mentorship, it's a no-brainer, right? Mentors can help in providing support and reassurance. They can talk about their own experience, create a layer of connectivity. They can also understand challenges that people may face, particularly women, since we're talking about gender, and also help with creative solutions that might work. Sometimes there isn't a one-fit-all strategy. It's, you're a female, you're dealing with this because you're a female,
mm,
and let's figure out how we may navigate through that. And so I think what mentorship can do is it can help give women in finance the confidence to believe that they have a sustainable career trajectory.
mm,
There is not a glass ceiling. The progression can be achieved. And really, that achievement is not a case of if, it becomes a case of when. And so, I would very much encourage women who are in the industry to take that responsibility and onus of mentoring other women, of paying it forward, or of helping facilitate some of these types of activities. It can be completely informal. You can just have a check-in with a coffee with somebody and say, "How are you going? How can I help?"
mm,
And sometimes you can have a more formal framework, and you can have,
mm,
an organization help put in place what the agenda for those discussions and the frequency and the cadence of those looks like, and also
mm.
collect benchmarking data against that. But I think whichever approach you take, I think a sincere relationship from a mentoring perspective will 100% add enormous value for any woman working in financial services anywhere in the world. And I say that having worked across the globe in my 20 years doing this.
Mm, mm,
And it's a universal
mm.
need with universal benefits.
Bijna, you must have done the same, right? Mentored a lot of young women. Any story which stands out, which you can share with our listeners that, okay, when I did this and now I see the fruit of my labor.
For me, I think it would be unfair to say one. I've had many. I have for a long time and continue to mentor young people at sort of college and university level who are trying to get into careers into financial services, sort of guiding them. Look, financial services is very broad. And I think, one of the learnings for me was I was not prepared or aware of the intensity that sometimes comes with the industry. I was not self aware when I first started out in terms of how to manage my own learning. There's the technical aspect, which is the core competencies around doing the job for the line role that you're in. But the even bigger aspect around that is emotional intelligence, underpinned by empathy, right? And the World
Mm-hmm.
Economic Forum reported 6 or 7 years ago in a report that they released that as we become more technologically enabled, as more and more roles, all industries become more technologically demanding, yes, that competence to manage the technology becomes increasingly important. But the one thing that will set leaders apart and people who I deem to be, great leadership, uh, great leadership inspirations for me, my peers, my own management, but also the next level of people that I see as my successors, people that I want to
Mm-hmm.
bring through to their leadership trajectory. So for me, I think to answer your question, there are multiple examples where I've had these discussions and people have said it's not something I'd ever thought about. It's never on a job description, but I'm going to go take a learning and I'm going to practice that, or I'm going to find a mentor that can help me with that.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other is, middle management. So typically in banking, all of the research, and I even wrote a paper on this for the University of Oxford a few years ago. Middle management is typically when you're at a stage in life where your responsibilities at home will increase. So you could have aging parents to take care of, you could have young children, you could be getting married. So a additional layer of personal responsibility. And
Mm.
then your responsibility at the same time at work increases. Typically, I'm not saying it's for
Yeah.
everyone, but that's a typical
Mm.
model. So
Mm-hmm.
if work
Mm-hmm.
increases and home increases in terms of demands, and you've still only got 24 hours in the day, you've got to find a different way of navigating that, right? And so
Mm-hmm.
what I found even through the pandemic, right, was a lot of women, and I keep going back to women since we're talking about gender today, a lot of women, particularly from the Indian diaspora or from Asian backgrounds, had a huge challenge, right? So this
Mm.
not only backs up the data, but it tells me that something needs to change. So in terms of tangible actions, one thing that I rolled out was educating the men in the workplace, saying, listen, do you realize the women in your household, could be your wife, could be your sister, could be your mother, they are dealing with increased pressure at work. And I had, as a manager, a lot of conversations with some very smart women who were at sort of assistant vice president level saying, I'm not sure I can handle this and my family's my priority. So what do I do? So the first step was educating the men, saying, there are small things you can do that will make a really big difference. Are you open to it? And it was amazing. All of the men in that I was working with in India through the pandemic wanted to have really interesting conversations here, saying, nobody flagged it, but of course we are willing to support and we are willing to do what it takes to kind of share the burden. So that was a beautiful, I think, learning for all. The other piece is, as an organization, right? We all learned in the pandemic to work remotely. So, what other measures could we take to create that flexibility and fluidity?
Mm.
So, our middle management are have the autonomy to say, I need to go do what I need to do for my family, but I'm going to come back and deliver what I need to for work because I'm passionate about my career and I absolutely want to be here for the long term.
Mm.
And so that also was a learning for us, but we did a lot of test and learn, and it worked out really well. And in fact, we promoted a lot of female colleagues through that journey and got them to kind of the next stage. So I think flexibility from an organizational perspective, understanding the cultural component, understanding intersectionality, providing a layer of trust and autonomy for your female colleagues to be able to navigate what they need to when they need to, providing mentorship in the background, providing allyship in the workplace with male colleagues. I think those factors combined,
Mm.
for me, helped a lot of beautiful examples to go back to your question. So I would never say that I'll take full credit for any one of those. They were always team efforts. And I think, it takes a collective. We say it takes a village to raise a child. I think
Hmm, hmm.
it takes a collective to change the social status quo, and this is an example of where we
Yeah.
did that.
To talk about business, right? So, what's the advantage you see in having a more diverse workforce?
Look, there are umpteen examples, but before we talk about, a more diverse workforce, I just want to flag why we're not there, right? Even today,
Hmm,
there are 130 million girls on the planet that are not allowed to be at school. We live in a world where education is being granted online during the pandemic, but 130 million girls, because of social cultural reasons, are not permitted in education. We have parts of the world where Africa is home to the largest millennial population in the world. So that's the future of our world. But there's only one teacher for every 80 students, right? And today we live in a world where 500 million women globally are still unable to read. So for me, we are living in a global crisis if we talk about gender disparity. And I think for as long as these underlying issues and these underlying gaps pertain, we're never going to permit equality, and the disparity will just continue to get wider and wider. So I think before we talk about the benefits of bridging that disparity, we just need to be very, very aware of the real situation that we are dealing with. And also, look, we've got a humanitarian crisis. The
hmm,
war, and the reference to Ukraine, what we saw with Afghanistan, we have seen a significant slowdown in global economic growth. And then we add to that inflation, we see the cost of living crisis in some countries. What this has done, and again, this is not me, this is the monetary funds data. It talks very clearly about the fact that women are at the burning end of this, right? All over the world. They are absolutely at the burning end of this. They are the most economically impacted. They are the most strained from a day-to-day perspective. They are the ones that are carrying the burden in terms of duties in the home. And so, again, we need to, I think the way in which we need to bridge the gender gap in the
hmm,
workplace, and here we're
hmm,
talking about financial services, now is very different to the way in which we looked at it before the pandemic, right?
hmm,
We
hmm,
definitely understand that gender inclusive growth and economic resilience are now today linked, whereas we haven't looked at that previously as a global society. Now, what I would say is the benefit of closing gender gaps can stimulate economic growth, they can strengthen macroeconomic and financial stability, and they can absolutely reduce income inequality, which we've known about, but the bridge is getting broader and we need to reel that back in.
hmm,
So there was, in fact, there was a really interesting keynote on the gender balance in the financial sector from the deputy managing director of the International Monetary Fund and the IFC. Her name is Antoinette Saye. And this is very recent. And she talked about the fact that, again, women are bearing the biggest brunt of the pandemic, particularly as primary caregivers in the home. And what she said was that they paid the price in the last 2 years, not only with their jobs, incomes, and economic security, but now families are being dislocated. So she's saying that by closing this gap, in financial services to start with, they are preparing their first ever strategy to integrate gender issues into the IMF's core work on surveillance. And I
hmm,
think that is really important. I think that speaks volumes, and I think a lot of organizations can follow suit in kind of their strategy and the kind of work that they're promoting. But there's also a lot of really interesting analysis to say, look, if you've got increase of gender diversity on boards in the financial sector, it is directly associated with stronger financial outcomes for the firm. It is
hmm, hmm,
directly associated with reduced risk. It is directly associated with greater financial stability. And I think, again, these are very significant and yeah, impactful benefits that both organizations and economies can realize by bridging the diversity gaps that we see.
hmm. I agree. I agree. Coming to our final question, what's your advice to girls who want to work in the financial sector?
I would say absolutely go for it. Absolutely go for it and give it your 100%. but do it in an informed way. There's a lot of information. That IMF report that we just talked about being one, there's a lot of information out there on, the value you as a female can bring to an organization with your identity, with your diverse identity, right? But also, I would say it's important to understand what the different dimensions of your identity can bring to the table, right? So whether it's your gender, your orientation, your race, religion, disability, age, your political beliefs, your location, geography, your ethnic, social and cultural norms. I think these do definitely have a role to play in manifestation with the firms. And again, there was a very interesting report that I came across a few weeks ago, which was by the FSI, and that's FSI stands for Financial Stability Institute. And the report was called Diversity and Inclusion, Embracing the True Colors in Financial Supervision. And this is from May of this year. And the report basically talks about, if you're aware of your D&I dimensions, so your color, your gender, your age, all these things we talk about, they have two manifestations directly within the organization, within the financial services organization. So the first is you have an internal manifestation within the firm. You have a line into board membership composition. You have a line into gender targets for senior management, so management of the future. You have a line into unions and compensation packages around equal gender pay. And by the way, a few years ago, Ernst & Young reported that we're still 210 years away from equal pay in this industry. And that was before the pandemic. And then you also have a line into accessibility for office space, equipment, and then retention strategy. So if you are a young woman entering an organization, it's not just a case of you're ticking the box and signing your contract and going in to do your job. You are actually influencing policies around these internal manifestations within the firm, and you will be making a case for change even without realizing it to a great degree. So that's the first thing. The second thing is there's an external manifestation. So again, how the organization talks about its female representation, its ethnic minority representation, how it promotes, careers for the next layer of women coming in, let's say as graduates, who then go on to have families and progress in their careers. It basically outlines a non-discriminatory underwriting criteria. It helps organizations design accessibility not only to careers, but to their products and services. And I think I think it's important to know that you are changing the game by being yourself, but it's important if you can connect the dots to becoming a future mentor, to becoming someone that becomes a role model, to becoming an ally. So I would say do it, but do it eyes wide open and consciously try and pay it forward.
That's interesting, and that's good food for thought. I hope that people who are listening to us will incorporate all these ideas. Bijna, on that note, thank you very much for being part of the TUSB conversations.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.